Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Black Opening Workshop with Yuriy Krykun. It is a pleasure for me, Pascal Charbonneau, to introduce him today. I think this is his first time on Chess 24. Welcome, Yuriy.
Hi, everyone, and hi, Pascal. Thank you so much for introducing me. Indeed, that's my first stream for Chess24, and I hope that's just the beginning. So, the goal of today's stream, well, there are actually several goals. I wanted to showcase you a little bit my latest chessable course on the accelerated Queen's Indian, the position that arises after d4, knight to f6, c4, and pawn to b6. And at the same time, I'm very open to answering any kind of questions of yours, both opening wise and any general questions on chess improvement or whatever it is. We hope to make the shows regular, or at least I do. And hopefully in the future, there will be a lot more questions by you guys that I can prepare for in advance. But there haven't been too many questions yet, so I thought it would make perfect sense to start this by demonstrating to you one of my recent games in the Queen's Indian, which would hopefully explain to you better why I like this opening so much and why I even felt willing to recommend it in a huge course. Um, it was played at a very important tournament at the decisive round of the 2019 Pan American Intercollegiate Championship, where, depending on the outcome, not just of my game, of course, but of the on the outcome of the entire match of my team and the other team, it would be decided whether we would qualify for the Final Four, the most prestigious collegiate tournament in the United States, or not. Um, I was playing a very talented Slovakian grandmaster, Christopher Repka, with the black pieces, and I thought it would be very appropriate to give Queen's Indian a try. It's a very solid opening. So here I started with the more classical move order with the move e6, and after knight f3 b6, we begin. Now we get to our repertoire. I'm not sure if Pascal is here, if he would participate and maybe ask some questions too. But so far, I'll just make a few first moves pretty quickly, and maybe I'll mention a few ideas too, and we'll start discussing the a rising middle game, which I think is very interesting. I think some of you might have already seen it because I know several private students of mine are watching this broadcast at the moment. But most of you haven't, so I hope you'd enjoy it. Now, my opponent played g3, which is one of the main systems. And after a few natural moves, there is also a move bishop a6 here, by the way, attacking the pawn on c4 immediately, which is a more concrete line, while bishop b7 is more of a system, which is a lot more universal. And after a few more natural moves, knight to c3, my opponent started fighting for the center. He might want to push d5 and restrict my bishop on b7, or he might want to play something like queen d3 and e4 and grab the center. So the main theoretical move here, for a good reason, is knight to e4, immediately challenging the white knight on c3. And at this point, white already has a plethora of choices. Back in the day, in 50s, 60s, 70s of the last century, the main move has always used to be queen to c2. Um, Obviously, attacking the knight on e4 and protecting the knight on c3. But then people realized that after something like queen c2, knight c3, queen c3, and let's say d6, and there are other moves as well in this position, such as, for example, f5 or bishop to f6 or c5. But d6 is the move that I'm recommending in my course, so I thought I would mention it here. Black is very, very solid, and for instance, after queen c2 f5, he is able to control the entire long diagonal fairly well, just as the key square on e4, and white's never really able to push pawn to e4 here all that easily. So during some of the recent years, thanks to the effort of many top players, notably Aronian, for example, the move bishop d2. So the spotlight. White's idea here is that he's still willing to prevent knight c3, which doubles the white pawns, by taking back with the bishop, but he is not wasting any time by moving his queen yet. And it's important that white doesn't really mind giving up this bishop pair, because after queen d2, unfortunately, the bishop on b7 is going to be shut down pretty quickly with d5 and e4. And well, actually, a lot of positions of this kind are pretty decent for black, and that's the position we'll have in the game soon. But because the bishop on d2 is not really doing all that much harm, it doesn't really make sense to take it immediately. Oh, actually, I already see the first question in the chat asking what I would have played after 3 knight c3. That's a good one. We'll return here very, very quickly, shortly after, perhaps after we finish talking about this game, which wouldn't take too long. So at this point, I played d6, showing white that while I might take his bishop or I might take his knight, I'm not in any rush so far. And at this point, white cannot really improve his position all that much anymore, and he can't really it doesn't really make sense for him to wait. So he typically make moves like, for example, queen c2 attacking this knight, or d5, and that's exactly what my opponent did. He went d5 here. I traded and went e5. Actually, I think taking with the knight here is a better move, because white's goal in such positions should be to initiate some play with f4, or possibly with b4 and c5. And the knight on d2 would prove helpful both for the sake of possibly coming on c4 and for the sake of liberating the path for that f pawn so that it can move to f4. But my opponent took with the queen, and after e5, e4, knight d7, a few more natural moves, we've reached a very, very interesting middle game position. And I wanted to say a few words to explain why I like it so much. As we can see here, the board is full of pieces. At the same time, no player is facing, any direct threats yet. So as it's easy to see, the game will be very strategic, very maneuvering, at least for now. And the good news is that it's very easy. I mean, it's not, even though Queen's Indian defense is considered a very solid opening, it's not an opening where we are just trying to swap a lot of pieces and get a draw quickly while not really pretending for more. We keep all the pieces on the board. We keep all the pawns on the board. So far, only one pair of minor pieces has been traded, and obviously, under such circumstances, both players have very good chances to win. It's very possible to outplay your opponent from here with either color. So it's a very solid line where if you're facing a stronger opponent, you won't get smashed off the board quickly. But at the same time, if you're facing a weaker player, it's a position where you can definitely play for a win, which in my opinion is very, very attractive. Now, my opponent played knight to e1, his idea being, of course, to push pawn to f4 here. And I was still in preparation. Actually, I was already preparing my course back then, and I knew this position. I went bishop to g5. And at this point, my opponent did something that was, I believe, pretty new to me back then. It's very principled to continue with f4 here, because that's something white has been preparing with his previous move. And that's the move that has been played, I believe, in some game of, I'm not actually sure who was white, but I think Zakhar Yefimenko had the black pieces, famous Ukrainian grandmaster and Kramnik's second for many years. And here, after bishop h6, knight d3, I found a very interesting novelty, which I'm discussing in a lot of detail in my course, which is to take on f4, and after g takes f4, to continue with knight to e5. The point being that the bishop is placed in an excellent manner on h6, and because of the spin, black's easily able to afford such a move. And now the pawn on c4 is hanging. Now the e-pawn can never move, and the problem is that if white is to defend it somehow with, let's say, b3, black has a very nice continuation f5, and the entire white center is just about to collapse. For example, after ef rook f5, it's clear black should already be better. White didn't manage to make much use of his center, and black has the bishop pair. The bishop on b7 is not that active yet, but it can easily enter the game shortly after, let's say, bishop c8, bishop f5 in the future. So black's position is just very, very comfortable. My opponent continued with something like queen to e2, keeping the tension. And after bishop h6, knight d3, knight c5, takes. He started thinking. He fell, I think, for a very deep thought, and after about maybe 20 or 25 minutes, he continued with the slightly mysterious move, pawn to a4. I'm actually not sure how do I remove all these arrows, because it would be really nice not to give out any hints to the viewers so that they can they don't. Okay, delete. Yeah, looks like this. Now you don't have any arrows. Sorry, it's my first time with the Chess24 broadcast, so I'm still discovering some features. Now, the idea of the move a4, as I figured, was just to push a5, a6. And the problem is that this pawn on a7 might be pretty weak after white pushes the pawn on a6 and gets to play knight b5, harassing this pawn. And at this point, of course, black needs to make some pretty responsible decision on whether to allow for this advance or whether to play a5 or whether to play a6. And obviously, both moves make sense, but somehow I wasn't that fond of the fact that after a5, knight to b5, the square on b5 would be weak for good, and I won't be ever able to kick this knight out. So I didn't really feel like doing that. And on the other hand, while I could have played a6, of course, I thought, well, if white would push his pawn on a5, I could consider playing a6 a bit later. Why would I do it here? So I improved my bishop to begin with, because it clearly didn't have much to do on b7. And then after a5, rook to b8, I immediately took control of the b file, because unfortunately with this push, white weakened the b pawn quite a lot, as well as the squares in b3 and b4. And after rook to b1, I thought white clearly wants again to push this a6 and knight to b5. And if I play a6 myself here, I can definitely do that, but I wasn't all that happy, because had white continued with something like knight a2 and b4 later on, I feel like his play might actually kind of get, justified. What white has been doing so far, I don't think is very reasonable, but now it can actually prove quite useful. And for example, after some move before, it looks to me like the white pieces are actually getting fairly active. C5 might follow, the pawn on a6 might be a problem. I still need to figure out how to highlight these pawns with different colors, with the red color, for instance, to show weaknesses. But okay, I guess I'll do it for the next broadcast. So this position somehow I was not all that happy with, which is why I had to look for a different plan. And actually, I know we are in a live show, so perhaps I won't be able to make that big a pause and give you a chance to think for too long, because, well, obviously, we don't have enough length of a show for that. But I know some of you might be watching this in the recording, so for those of you who will, I would encourage you to stop the video at this point and think how you would continue with the black pieces. What would you do as black here? Okay, now I hope those of you who will be watching this as a recording will stop. Okay, I already got some answers in the chat. f5 is an interesting move, of course. I totally agree. But the problem is that, well, white still has these ideas with a6 and with knight to b5. So we need to somehow react to this, which is why I ended up playing queen to g5. The point being that if white doesn't do anything, like if white just, let's say, kicks my queen out, asking what I wanted to play queen to d2, utilizing finally the potential of this bishop. And then after, for instance, takes, of course, if black gets to, at some point, let's say, take this knight, and then start attacking the pawns with moves like bishop a6, white won't have too much fun. His position would be simply clearly worse. Actually, my apologies, a slight technical question. I think I was using the wrong camera for all this time. My huge apologies. Wait. Sorry. Mm.
We were able to see you okay before. Now we don't see
Um,
you though.
I'm very sorry. I think. Um, hmm.
This is an interesting variation, by the way. I'm learning something. I don't really know. I don't really know much about the Queen's Indian, other than having seen, of course, games happen, every day or so. But I've never really played it or thought of having it really as a repertoire. And if I did, I was always playing with Bishop A6, not with Bishop B7. So I don't know much about these lines, but it's very interesting.
Yeah, my apologies, guys, for this small technical interference. I'm actually not sure what happened. Basically, the idea was that I was supposed to use a different camera, which is a lot better than the one you were seeing previously, and I changed it, but for some reason, you're not able to see it on the stream, which I have no idea. Which I have no idea about, and um, hmm, and I can see it in my settings, and I can't even change to the previous one, so I'm not actually sure. I hope we'll fix this very, very quickly. But we can keep speaking about the position so far. So I'll ask you a question, and I hope for your understanding that that you will allow us for a slight pause for a minute to fix the technical issue. So white can make a move like knight to b5 here, and it looks like there is a problem because now two pawns are hanging. What was my idea here? How was I supposed to meet this move? Um, okay, now it is working, yeah, finally. Okay, my huge apologies, everyone, for for having the slight issue. But I hope the result will justify itself. The camera, as the camera I was supposed to use, is a lot better. So hopefully you'll see me in the much higher resolution in a second. Um, so here, indeed, the problem is, as has been pointed out in the chat by Gevorg, you're absolutely correct. The problem is that after the move a6, if white gets too greedy and snatches this pawn, it's really difficult to get this knight out. It is trapped. And I guess there are a few ways how we can take advantage of this. Perhaps the easiest is something like rook d8. And unfortunately, this knight will simply get trapped and lost. So white white shouldn't really be doing this. Being too greedy is not a good idea. So my opponent continued with the move a6, which is a very natural continuation of his plan. And at this point, of course, I need to deal with knight b5, knight a7 somehow, because this a pawn is already running way too far. I definitely don't want my a pawn to get lost and his a pawn to queen. So when bishop d7. Now, black's idea, of course, might be to play queen d2, like we just said, or I could continue with moves like rook b4, rook b8, and start building some very serious pressure over here on the queen side, because clearly white has weakened way too many squares. And if he doesn't justify the run of his a pawn, he might simply end up clearly worse. So my opponent didn't really have that much of a choice here. He continued with knight to b5, and here I took, and white took back. Now, I'd like to ask you a small question. Hopefully, those of you who are watching live are fast thinkers, and those of you who will be watching the recording here will take their time. What positional threat does White have at the moment, and how can we meet it? What do we need to do in order to stop it? Alrighty, I hope you did have some time to think. I know for the live show it's way too fast, but unfortunately we have some time constraints. Um, so Gevorg says b6 is White's idea. Well, I'm not so sure because after b6, I think I will be very, very glad to simply snatch this pawn. And not only it gives me a pawn, but also I'll be able to start putting more pressure on the b file. But in fact, I see White's idea as pawn to b4. The problem here, if we made some random move like king h8 and White played b4, the problem is that while, of course, the position might seem very solid for us, the pawn on c7 here is a huge issue, and pretty soon White will be able to build up quite a lot of pressure on this pawn. And, well, you can arguably, of course, try to bring your bishop to d8 and defend like this, but it would be no fun at all. White would clearly be able to keep improving his position. Maybe at some point he'll even sacrifice an exchange there on c7 because then the a7 pawn might be a huge target and so on and so forth. So while we can discuss, whether it's a big deal that White will get to take this pawn, we definitely don't want such a position to arise. It's very passive. So because b4 is an idea, we need to go queen to d2, stopping this plan. At this point, if White were to take, and bring his rook over, let's say, to d1, I could have, of course, easily gone back, but then again, this b4 followed by rook b1 might be nasty. And I know, let's say here, White doesn't have the time to do it right away because his pawn on b5 is under attack. So let's say first bishop f1. And I think we're still doing completely all right after something like f5. But the ideas with b4 in the future might be a little bit annoying. So it would make tons of sense to instead simply continue with something like bishop b4, stopping his idea for good, attacking the pawn on b5, preparing f5, and Black's position, I think, is already clearly a little better because the white bishop's not really doing all that much, and Black, I think, will be able to develop some pressure over the f file. Now, my opponent instead started with the move bishop f1, which I have met by f5. At this point, I was already thinking, to be honest, that I had seized the initiative. And after ef, rook f5, rook d1, I was not that interested in the queen trade anymore. I think it was definitely possible to trade when, after, let's say, taking rook f8, Black would be cleared a little bit better. After, say, rook f1, it looks like our bishop's more useful. The pawns on b5 and d5 are not all that fantastic, but it won't be so easy to keep making progress here. So I thought I would be able to trade at any point when I want, and I went queen to b4, asking White what he is planning to do, because here I can keep putting pressure over the f file. Actually, if it was my turn, I think White would be already facing quite a serious amount of trouble. And at this point, my opponent, who was already in some very serious time scramble, started going wrong a little bit. He went bishop h3 and brought the bishop all the way there to protect the pawn on b5, which is something I can definitely understand. It's a very natural human decision. You don't want to keep the bishop on f1. You want your rook to be able to return. But unfortunately, the problem is that now the bishop is completely misplaced and it's not able to protect the white king. So Black's position is already massively better. He went rook to f1. And here, unfortunately, I also got into time trouble by this point as well. And I could not really figure out how to make some decisive progress. And I would like you to think a little bit, maybe 10 seconds, not more, because the live show constraints. But the people who are watching it in the recorded version would have more time. What would you do here as Black? Alrighty, I hope you did have a little bit of time. At this point, black had a very strong move rook f3, which looks pretty natural, intending to simply push e4, e3, or maybe after e4, he could continue with something like g6 and bishop g7, bringing the bishop over to d4, or simply harassing the opponent b2. And unfortunately for white, his position is just so difficult, it's nearly hopeless. And I can give some sample lines, like for example, something like that. Rook to b3, now switching the attention to the b pawn, and then something like e4, preparing to pay his pawn another deal of attention. And of course, white's position is absolutely terrible, it's falling apart. But unfortunately, at this point, I, being in the time trouble, decided to just make a few useful moves first. I played g6 and let white coordinate his pieces a little bit. When, well, there were a few more moments which could have potentially be discussed, but the true conclusion is that I had some very attractive point when I could have made a lot of progress, and here I was still a little bit better, but it was already not that easy to find anything concrete. And of course, it's possible to keep squeezing this position forever as black, and obviously, you know, if you get to such a position with the black pieces in a tournament game, you have to keep trying because you're not risking at all. But unfortunately, I hadn't used my maximal chance. Now, at this point, I was already actually quite relaxed because even though I did indeed miss my chance to nearly win, the good news is that since it was a team match, the main attention wasn't on my games. The main attention was on the final score, and it was being played on 4 boards. And at this point, 2 games have been drawn. My game was still going on. I was a little better without ever risking to lose, and my teammate was actually nearly winning. So apparently, I thought, well, I can just keep trying a little bit, and if he wins, I can call it a draw at any point without risking. Apparently, my opponent also thought the same way because here he actually, as I could tell, even was trying to play for a win, which is, in my opinion, very deserves a lot of respect because he was willing to risk his own result and his own rating for the sake of the team. And I think actually such players are quite a rarity. Most players in chess, unfortunately, are not often able to go beyond their own ambitions, and oftentimes they are not willing to sacrifice their own result or risk too much or not risk too much for the sake of the team. My opponent clearly was willing to give it a try, even in a pretty bad position. But objectively speaking, chess-wise, of course, he has no reasons to be playing for anything here. And I thought I'd wait a little bit, and finally I went with the rook to f3. At this point, we were both in a mutual time scramble. I guess we had like 2 minutes each or 1 perhaps. And at this point, as soon as I released my hand, I realized something bad has happened. What was it? What idea did white have here, which would have been very strong? I'm not saying it's winning or anything. It's not, but it would have made me quite nervous. What tactical idea can white try to use in this position? Okay, I hope you did give this a bit of a thought. As always, I give people who are watching this live just a bit of time, but people who are watching the recorded show have, of course, the infinite amount of time to solve these problems. So at this point, unfortunately, with my last move, somehow I wasn't too careful. And the thing is that now these rooks, both of them are protecting each other and are barely able to move because, well, you can't move this rook on b3 without losing the one on f3, and you can't move the rook on f3 much farther than just to 1 square on d3. And unfortunately here, my opponent could play b6, which would have scared the hell out of me, because obviously I can't take with the a pawn, this one will just queen, and I can't take with the rook because then white will just win this one. So I'd need to take with the c pawn. And all of a sudden, this bishop, which was rather dead than alive during the last 10 or 15 moves, suddenly springs back to life with the move bishop a4. Now, my rook is forced. my rook is protecting this one, and it is forced to go to d3, but then there is bishop b5. And if I were to play rook to b3, there is bishop c4. With such a wonderful maneuver, white manages to improve his bishop's position so much that suddenly I'm getting my rook trapped and I'm losing an exchange, which you might argue might not even be a huge deal objectively, because the position is still fairly closed and black might still be able to hold a draw. But of course, it would be a huge disappointment in a position where you are not risking at all, in a position where a draw most likely wins your team the match, and where most likely it qualifies your team to the important next stage of the tournament, to blunder in one move and have to suffer for a draw for many, many more moves from now on, when the opponent can play without any risk. And imagine even losing such a position. That would be a huge fail. So thankfully, there was still a salvation for black here, which lies in the fact that white rooks are very, very inconveniently placed. And black had the lovely move rook d2 here. The point being, if white takes this one, I take this one. And if white takes on d2 after bishop d2, I'm attacking this one. And very fortunately now, if white attacks my bishop in some way, I can attack his. And whenever white moves his bishop away, I can attack his again. And here I'm even winning. So white cannot allow for that. And objectively speaking, he needs to play something like rook e5, rook g3, or rook f2, and then we take. Or he can even take, for instance, bishop e1. And this is going to be an easy draw because, of course, black won't ever find a way to break through with his extra pawn. Now, either my opponent saw this entire line, and he thought I saw it as well, and he didn't want to go here, or he didn't see the idea b6 at all. I don't know what it was, but he didn't play b6, thankfully. And I was able to get another to get another chance to keep playing this a little bit for a win. And most importantly, I'd never risk to lose unless I was willing to keep my rook here on f3 forever. So I went back, and here I told myself, okay, this has been enough. My teammate is winning. I'm not trying to push my luck. Draw would win us the match. That's good enough. So I've waited a little bit, and after some moves, my opponent actually here gave me another chance all of a sudden. He went rook to e2, which proved to be a terrible move. Or not a terrible move, but clearly not a very good one, because at best he might still be able to hold, but objectively it's giving me plenty of new opportunities. So at this point, black has some very strong move, which again, I would be happy to offer that you find if you're watching this as a recording. If you're watching this live, well, you have some 5 or 10 seconds before I'll show it. The problem is that with his last move, white just stopped controlling the square on c1. And after rook e2, bishop c1, it turns out there's a big problem with this pawn. Again, there was no time to calculate, so when my opponent played rook to e1 here, I was not able to work anything out after, let's say, bishop b2, rook b1, and there's a pin, and white's going to play rook e2 next. And, well, there's just nothing. It's not just me being unable to calculate this. Black shouldn't be too happy to go here. Or, for example, I could have made some other moves like bishop d2, but I thought the most practical decision, considering our team has already nearly won the match, was to play rook takes on b2. And then after rook c1, rook f2, we agreed to a draw at this point, because I'm able to give a perpetual. But actually, what is interesting is that when I was analyzing this later on, it turned out this position is not a forced draw. It is a position which is massively better for black. Black is hugely better. Black is nearly winning, I would even say. For example, after a move like rook g3, it turns out that the white king is very weak. The white bishop on c6 is absolutely useless. It's not worth more than a pawn. And it can't really go too far because white will lose either this stuff or the pawn on d5 somehow. Black can try to push g5, activate his king, start rolling the h pawn. There's still a chance some mating threats will actually appear, like some rook h3, rook h1 or something. And white, well, I mean, most likely black would always would always be able to give a perpetual check or something. So yeah, here here apparently I realized the team was winning the match. So we just agreed to a draw. I wouldn't have given more than a perpetual. In an individual tournament I would have played on, I guess, or I would not have sacrificed, the piece on C1. I would have just continued in a slightly better endgame. But in a team tournament, it's important to think not just about yourself, but about the entire team's ambitions and goals. So I wanted to showcase this game because I think it's a great illustration of what opportunities the Queen's Indian defense can give you, even versus very strong opponents. For example, in this game, my opponent was rated about 130 points higher than me. And as you can see, I was still able to outplay him slowly. And even though I couldn't convert, it's clear that, this position is not bad at all for black. It's fighting, yet it's very solid. And even the strong opponents, even grandmasters, oftentimes find it difficult to maneuver slowly in such positions. And on the other hand, as for you guys, if you study them carefully, if you study my course, for instance, you'll know every single detail. You'll know all the ins and outs. You'll know what are the typical plans, what are the typical goals, what kind of end games we want to get, what kind of typical positions we want to avoid, what kind of traps we want to avoid, and so on and so forth, which will give you, of course, a huge competitive edge. Now, that we're done with this game, it's actually time to address some of the questions in the chat. I see the question by David, and I see a question by Ekim, um, who asked about some of the theoretical lines in the accelerated Queen's Indian. So actually, let me talk to you guys a little bit about the concept behind my course, because some of you might have already seen, let's say, the banner and checked it out and might wonder more specifically about the concrete lines, but some of you might have no clue about what I'm talking about yet. So let me explain. So after d4, knight f6, c4, most grandmasters' preparation, for instance, includes three openings at this point. Let's say they play e6, and after knight c3, they go for the Nimzo. But white can also play g3. You cannot say I'm going for the Nimzo here because it's going to be Catalan. It's a different opening, which black also needs to know. And black can try to, steer the game into some Benoni positions where black can try to play d5, but that's another opening. And then finally, if white plays knight to f3 here, that's another opening because after, for example, d5, knight c3, black can do many things. He can play Queen's Gambit Declined, or Vienna, or Rogozin, or Semi-Tarash, or the trendy lines with a6 and stuff. But this is not going to be Nimzo. This is going to be something else. So black needs to know three huge mainstream variations, which, of course, is something grandmasters would do. It's their job. They do it for living. They want to play the most principled variations, and that's very understandable. But even myself, even though I'm a FIDE master with two IM norms, and I plan on getting the third one and hopefully fighting for the GM title at some point, I do understand there's a lot of other things we mere mortals need to do. We need to work on our middle game, on the end game and stuff. We need to, well, most likely we have some other responsibilities as well in life besides chess, so you can't afford to spend that much time. So what I'm suggesting instead is to continue after d4, knight f6, c4 with the move b6 in my repertoire. The point being that after knight f3, bishop b7, or e6, both are equally good, you get to the Queen's Indian, which is somewhere you can get after c4, e6, knight f3, and here b6 as well. But the problem is that here, as I said, white has knight c3 and g3 as well, which makes our choice a little less realistic. We need to be ready for three openings rather than one. So we'll place this move b6, and our goal is to get the Queen's Indian, like I said, e6 or bishop b7. And of course, it allows for a few other possibilities like knight c3, for example, bishop b7, f3, or queen to c2 on move 4. Or, for instance, white can play f3 here. And all of these moves definitely make a lot of sense. But the good news is that, well, first of all, black's positions are, I think, black's position is very decent in all these lines. And also, even if some lines are more challenging than others, I think you're guaranteed to know them a lot better than your opponents will. And very importantly, let's say when you play Queen's Indian like I do with the move bishop b7, not bishop a6, The huge advantage here to this approach is that you can meet moves like, for instance, knight f3, knight f6, g3, b6 with your plan. Because of course, if you were to play bishop a6 in the main line, to play bishop a6 here would be outright, fairly pointless. So we still get our setups, and you get to develop in pretty much the same manner, and it's likely to transpose to the positions we had just seen. Now, people are asking some questions in the chat, so I think it would be interesting to address those. Nick is asking why I didn't play the accelerated Queen's Indian in the game. Well, actually, I kind of did. I showed you this game. I have entered it in the database under such move order, but in fact, it started with knight f3. And here I went e6, c4, b6, which is something that we can get in our repertoire as well. I mean, our goal is to get the Queen's Indian after all. So after 2 knight f3, my opponent didn't have a possibility anymore to play, the Nims or the Catalan. I would not have allowed him. So I was actually perfectly ready to play the accelerated Nimzo. Now, speaking of a few other questions, you're interested in the most critical lines, which I completely understand. And I do think for sure that after c4, b6, the most critical lines are knight c3, bishop b7, queen c2, and the move f3 here. And there is also the move f3 a little later after knight c3, bishop b7, and f3 at this point, but I don't actually consider it to be all that dangerous at all. And I'm not sure how much I would be able to tell you now. Well, first of all, because there is quite a bit of things we need to know, at least desirably so. And of course, because I would like you to check out the main course, I won't be able to share everything here. Just for your information, there is about 18 hours of video instruction in the main course. So I guess, as hard as I would try, in some half an hour or 45 minutes, it would be barely possible to tell all of this. Well, the move knight c3, bishop b7, queen c2 is something that, for example, Grandmaster Kornev recommended in his book for White. I think he had published 3 books in that series: the White Repertoire, 1 book versus Nimzo Indian, and Queen's Gambit, 1 book against King's Indian and Grunfeld, or something like this. So he recommended this line. Apparently, his idea was to suggest something which wouldn't require too much theory. Actually, these positions are extremely similar to the so-called Petrosian variation of the Queen's Indian, which typically arises after moves like knight f3, e6, a3. And actually, admittedly, maybe this line is a tiny bit better for white than the Petrosian, but I think black is doing completely fine. And if you would just look at the list of players who tried this as black, you would find many 2700 players, many big names. But what's interesting is that after moves like d5, cd knight d5, for example, e4, takes, e6, we have some positions which are resembling of this Grunfeld structures. The only difference being that our bishop's not on g7, which is actually sometimes even good, because sometimes we can play c5, bishop b4 check, like in the semi-Tarrasch positions. And these positions are fairly well good for black objectively. Black is not worse, I think, at all from the objective perspective. The computer won't find any advantage if you analyze deeply. And the good news is that they're very fighting. I mean, it's very easy to get a position here where, again, you will be able to outplay your opponent. White has many possibilities. White typically, of course, continues with knight to f3, bishop e7. And here he plays bishop d3 or bishop b5 check. And then after c6, he goes back. Or White can do some other things. White can play, let's say, bishop e2. But what's likely to happen is that at some point you'll play c5, you'll take, you'll castle, for instance, and as a result, you have this position, which is very standard. It arises out of many openings where white has an extra pawn in the center, and black, on the other hand, has an extra pawn on the queen side. And these structures are well, there's of course plenty of guidelines how you want to handle the structures. But for example, one of the very common pieces of advice is that when you have an extra pawn on a flank on the queen side, it's likely you would be rather able to use it in the end game as opposed to the middle game positions, while the extra central pawn is likely to prove more helpful in the middle game. And of course, it's a little naive to hope to be able to discuss this position very extensively within 5 or 10 minutes, but I definitely think that black's chances are by no means lower at this point, and it's a very interesting position, definitely. I've actually played well, I'm not sure how serious this would sound, but I've actually played a bullet match with some grandmaster. I mean, I know it sounds pretty funny because I also am very skeptical of bullet as a form of chess. So yeah, it's rather entertainment. But I've played a match with some GM, and we've had like 10 games from which featured this position. I mean, not this position, but rather this one, because he would typically play, I think, bishop d3 or bishop b5, and somehow he was actually not all that happy with the outcome, I think. Um, yeah, this games, I think, can be easily found on my profile, either on lichess or chess.com, wherever it was. It's also interesting, of course, to discuss this move pawn to f3. And actually, at this point, yeah, white has another option too. White can choose to play in a rather solid manner, like, for example, knight f3 here, and after e6, bishop g5 and e3, which leads us to some versions of the Queen's Gambit declined. But I actually don't really think that White's pretending to have much here, even though he is very solid, because these positions of the Queen's Gambit declined are not something where white would always necessarily want to play queen to c2, because it can always get hit with rook c8 at some point. So I think here we actually have a little bit of an improvement. Now, returning back to the position after 2b6 and f3, which is definitely a very critical move, and Akim, who is asking this in the chat, is absolutely right. This move, I've analyzed it. I've analyzed it in fantastic detail for the course. I've consulted some of the leading white resources recommendations, such as, for instance, Boris Avrukh's course. Jesus, what am I saying? Course. Boris Avrukh's series of books, Grandmaster Repertoire, 2 books. The old one, I think, from 2010, and the new one from 2019. And he's recommending a very tricky line here for white, which I have addressed in the course. And actually, I think that it is possible to go for these positions, like you said, with the move d5. But I do think they're a little bit worse, even though they're also pretty interesting. But in my opinion, of course, the most principled move here by all means is knight to c6, which leads to a huge mess. And oftentimes, as you'll see in the course, we sacrifice pieces in those lines. Oftentimes, we end up even checkmating the white king somewhere in the center, or oftentimes we concede a lot of space to get some counterplay. These positions are very fun. And I won't lie, I would definitely admit, if there is a reason why you wouldn't want, or not even why you wouldn't want to play the Queen's Indian, the accelerated Queen's Indian, but why you would maybe doubt its theoretical soundness, this is this line for sure. This is the most critical line white has at his disposal. But I personally think black is getting very decent positions. Yeah, white might be able to retain, an advantage 0-20 or 0-30 according to the engine in 1 or 2 lines, literally, which have almost never have been seen in practical games. I think in the most critical line, there's 5 or 7 games in the database, which is absolutely nothing. If you're rated below 2,400 FIDE, you won't ever even see that position in your life. You'll always get away with this variation. And if you are above this level, I still think it's a very decent weapon. I myself definitely feel ready to play it. And as you have said yourself, Duda played it, Mehmet played it, and many other players have given this a try. So this can't be bad at all. And actually, it's interesting to mention Mehmet here also went for the lines bishop b7, e4, when he would play something like e6 and d5. So black has about 3, I think, interesting approaches to this position. And I personally believe in the move knight c6. I personally think this is definitely the most ambitious way for black to continue. And it's the most challenging move, which requires white to know way more. But at the same time, if you would feel those positions are too sharp, or if you would feel that those positions are, not something you like because of the character of the position or the evaluation or whatever it is, you will have the variety. And the move f3, I think has been played in less than 10% of the games which have reached this position. Now, another very good question was asked in the chat by P. Srinivasan, whether this can be played against the London system. Well, the London system is in a league of its own, but actually it is covered in my course. So white can start with bishop f4, and white can start with knight to f3. And those are slightly different positions. If you play, let's say, Queen's Gambit declined, or if you play, I don't know, the Slav, because you're likely to be happy to meet this move with something like this. And then if white places his knight on f3, it has been considered for a long time that these positions are fantastic for black. That black's able to jump out with the queen on b6 and attack b2, and because black hasn't played d6, because his bishop can still get out after something like queen b3 c4, queen c2, bishop f5, black's position is clearly better. Well, during some recent years, this assessment has, well, I mean, the assessment of this specific position hasn't changed, but the assessment of this line overall has changed quite a bit on account of the fact that white has discovered a very interesting move knight d2 here, which after queen b6 dc leads to some very interesting complications, and white definitely has a full share of chances there. It's a very interesting, ambitious variation for white, which many strong grandmasters have been playing now. So I personally actually don't really think black necessarily needs to try to punish the difference between knight f3 and between bishop f4. For us, it wouldn't make too much of a difference. But the good news is that after, let's say, knight f3, white loses possibilities to play Catalan or to play the Nimza. So we start with e6. And then after c4, b6, we're back to our stuff, the Queen's Indian. And after bishop f4, you can still play all of those classical London positions. And I think there is about, I don't know, 5 or 7 good setups against the London. And actually, I personally would not say London is a harmless opening. I don't think so. I think it's a very challenging line. If the white player, very important, if the white player is ready to play it creatively, if the white player is ready to react differently in a principled manner to whatever we do. Because unfortunately for white, many club players like London because of its simplicity. They like London because they just feel they can, make all the same moves by hand without bothering to think too much until move 10 or move 15. Well, if you play London like this, just give it up. It's not a good idea. Neither for your for your for the sake of posing problems out of the opening, nor most importantly for your chess. But London is a very good idea indeed, or one of the very good ideas, if you don't mind a positional struggle and are ready to meet different various black setups with different reactions, with the ability to take advantage of some slight changes in the position. Well, at the same time, black objectively does have many good ways to continue against the London, and I'm offering one of them in my course. I think it's important to understand that when you play a line like this as black, while of course it's definitely possible to continue bishop d6 here, which is the absolute main line, you would need to know quite a lot. And I actually think the evaluation of this line has been challenged a little bit theoretically lately within the last few years. So I would personally prefer, unless you want to study quite a lot, and unless you are a seasoned grandmaster who just believes the opponents know every single detail in every single other line, I would personally suggest to go to some other places. For example, one interesting line is something that Mr. Jan Gustafsson has covered in his series on Chess24, CDD Knight H5, which I think is definitely interesting, even though it's pretty risky. But I'm recommending a different line in my course, which is very, very unexplored and which is very fresh. And I think it's actually perfectly sound. And hopefully you will check out the course to find out what line it is. But I would give in a small secret. You do get to this position, and then you get to choose. Then you can, then you make this move. But it's possible to get to this position from in various move orders, even if you are not, for example, a accelerated Queen's Indian player. If you play Slav or if you play Nimzo, you can still start like this. Or if, let's say, you start with d5, you can still get to this position in this manner. You can still play c5. knight c6, e6, and you can still arrive here. And actually, I'll analyze this position too without the white knight on f3, because white has some interesting ideas in a shelf, like let's say bishop d3, bishop d6, and after taking, white can try to take advantage of the fact the knight's still on g1 by playing f4. And that's another interesting setup, which we'd better know as black, because if we don't, it could be a little bit difficult. It could be a little bit difficult if white gets to play knight f3, castle, and knight e5, followed by some very easy play like rook f3, rook h3, or queen h5, or queen f3, or g4, g5. Our position can be pretty bad, can get pretty bad quite quickly. But fortunately, black does have even a few very good ways of encountering this, which we're also discussing. So hopefully that would answer the question of Mr. Sorry, it's a little difficult to pronounce the last name, Srinivasan. Now I believe we have a few more questions in the chat, and I would actually really welcome more questions, because I do have a few more games to show to you, but I think it could be even more beneficial to discuss some of the opening ideas and some of the approaches to the openings that I'm recommending. I believe there was a question on move. I think there was a question in the chess24 chat on move 1 knight f3 followed by b3, or on move b3 on move 1, which lies a little bit outside of the scope of this repertoire, but I would still like to give you a few guidelines. Well, in my opinion, when you're meeting a move like b3, or when you're meeting a move like g3, oftentimes, well, of course it's possible to try to pick a very, very concrete solution against it, like to play e5, which clearly sets you out in a very distinctive position, typical of move 1 b3. In my opinion, it's also quite practical to try to steer the game in the directions that you normally pick after moves, such moves as 1 d4 or 1 c4 or 1 knight f3. Meaning that, for instance, if you play King's Indian, you might want to play knight f6 and meet bishop b2 with g6, intending to just continue bishop g7 and castling. And it's important to understand you don't want to do it against no matter what, whether if, let's say, you don't play King's Indian as black versus a normal opening, versus the normal moves like d4, c4, and knight f3. Because white can play, let's say, knight f3, bishop g7, and then, let's say, g3. And all of a sudden, he might just change his mind, and you'll have to play either King's Indian setups or the Grunfeld setups against normal double fianchetto systems, which are not pure b3, but as you can see, white has a lot of flexibility. White can transpose here. So you don't want a situation like this to occur to you. But if, let's say, you play the actual King's Indian or the actual Grunfeld, you might definitely want to go here. And you will need to know the move bishop f6, which is definitely very interesting for white. But objectively speaking, this is another equal position where both players have chances. So the easiest perhaps could be if you play, let's say, King's Indian and Grunfeld, to simply stick to this move order. Another story is that, let's say, if you play, what else could it be? Let's say accelerated Queen's Indian, if we're already discussing my repertoire. Well, if you like the positions like that, you can definitely just play e6, b6, bishop b7, bishop e7. And it's likely at some point white will either continue with knight f3, g3, bishop g2, or possibly he will continue with moves like knight f3, and then, for instance, I don't know, e3, c4, when you'll just get to some pretty symmetrical positions, and there is no need to study, a whole new different system which starts with a move like e5. And same goes for players who play the Slav or the Queen's Gambit. It is very possible to use your normal openings, which you use against 1 d4 or 1 c4, against 1 b3 as well, in most cases. Unfortunately, not in all the cases, but in quite a lot of cases, you can definitely go about it in this way, which will simply save you a lot of work. But of course, if you're looking for some very principled ways to go, then yeah, for example, a move like e5 will be your choice, and then all these variations. Here you need to know the move knight f3, or you need to know the lines like e3, knight f6, bishop b5, bishop d6, and all this stuff, which is very trendy. But I think for most club players, for instance, because b3 is not a very frequent move, and because if you encounter it, it's likely that your opponent did look into this main stuff, unless he's very lazy and unless he just plays b3 randomly. But then I guess you don't need to know anything yourself either. Well, it's likely he had looked into this, so you might want to stick to something you would be more used to, and to something where he won't have, 10 times as much experience as yourself. So it definitely makes tons of sense to try to stick to your normal weapon of choice. At the same time, of course, if you're a title player, if you're just trying to be very principled and punish white playing b3, then yeah, that's, for example, where you go. And obviously, all these positions are roughly balanced. It's just a way to get an interesting game with white. So clearly there is no refutation to move b3 or something. It's a very interesting move. But that's the principled way to go if you're looking for it. And on the other hand, there was a question versus what to do versus one knight f3, I think, followed by b3, which, in my opinion, again, while I can try to give some pretty specific line, in my opinion, the real answer just depends on what opening you play versus one d4. For example, if you play the Queen's Gambit, you might just want to continue with moves like d5, e6, bishop e7. Why would you do something else? Or if you play King's Indian, you might want to continue with moves like g6, bishop g7, castling. Or if you play Queen's Indian, you might continue with moves like b6, bishop b7. Or if you play the Slav, you might set up some Slav sort of positions, d5, c6, bishop f5, or bishop g4. That is completely okay. So while it's possible to speak of some pretty specific setups, I think really the answer to this question mostly depends on what is your main opening versus one d4, one c4, and one knight f3. So yeah, I hope this answers your question. And I'm sorry I didn't go into too much detail about some specific line. I believe that if we host opening clinics, for example, on constant basis, I definitely will. It would be my pleasure. But in order to be able to answer this question in the most professional and in the most helpful manner possible, I would just need to know a little bit more about your background. I would need to know your level and how much you're willing to learn, what openings you're currently using, and stuff like that. So yeah, hopefully this answer is as good as it gets based on the amount of information I have. Now let me scroll through the chat to see whether we have any other questions. I don't think we have any in the YouTube chat. Now, what about chess24? I believe people were discussing moves like we're mostly discussing the moves that we had in the games that I was showing, the questions I was asking. But actually, I see one question here. Let me pull the position up. User Crypto is asking what to do with black after d4, knight f6, c4. Okay, then he is saying e6, knight f3, b6. Well, in the first place, speaking of my course, b6 is the way to go. But okay, anyway, joking aside, we get to this position no matter what. So bishop g2, bishop b7, and now knight to c3. And then he is saying d5, cd, ed. Well, in this position, I don't really see that much of a reason why all of a sudden you would want to change your plans and why you would want to play d5. That is definitely possible, but that is a very different setup from the one we typically use. And just to remind you, in positions like this, knight c3, well, black can also play d5, but that's not Queen's Indian. That's some slightly, versioned version of Catalan, which I personally don't have much of a desire to go into as black. I think white is just keeping the very nice pressure. And well, it is possible, of course, to go into these positions. I don't really see why we would want to do that. So in this position, I am not really sure why you would want to play d5 either. I think there are actually several ways how we can handle this, starting from the very standard ones, like simply bishop e7, followed by castling a knight e4, steering the game back into the usual direction. Or possibly it's interesting because the knight's already on c3. It might be interesting to consider moves like bishop b4, possibly clearly hinting that we might want to go knight e4, spoil the white pawns, or possibly intending to play bishop c3. Or it is possible to look at the move knight e4 immediately. Or it is possible to, even if you're feeling, even though this is probably not the best time to do it, but if you were feeling a little bit like a bully, you might consider even a move bishop f3, followed by some stuff like c6, d5. But okay, that's not going to be a very good version of this exchange. And actually, this trade does make sense once in a while in several positions. But yeah, here it wouldn't be the best time to do it. But we do have 2 or 3 good solid ways to continue. And speaking of me personally, I would not look forward to playing d5 here as black. I don't think this is, I mean, maybe it is even all right, but I don't think it is consistent with the way we want to play, based on my repertoire at least, and based on what I know best. So hopefully that answers your question. Now, what other questions might we have in the chat? I don't think we actually have any questions in the YouTube chat. So if you guys want to ask me anything, please make sure to do so right now, because I would definitely spot your question instantly and would answer it. Speaking of the Chess24 chat, I think all the questions have gotten answered as well. So I'm not actually... Okay, what's the plan against the King's Indian attack? That's a good one, Nick. Thank you. And this is the glory moment for my repertoire again. So the fantastic news about such an opening as the accelerated Queen's Indian is that we can make these moves pretty much against no matter what. And of course, as it's not too difficult to guess, I would be recommending the same setup against g3 here too. Now, after bishop g2, bishop to b7, it's very important, again, like I said some time ago, maybe half an hour ago, if you were to like setups like this in the main Queen's Indian, with the bishop on a6, unfortunately, after move 1 knight on f3, you would be a little bit out of book, because here to play bishop a6 at any point would be kind of dumb. And if you played bishop b7, your opponent would go d4 and c4. And while I, for example, am recommending these positions, if you were basing your play on bishop a6, you would clearly be out of book. So the good news is that we are not afraid of any transpositions whatsoever. And of course, here White can try a few separate independent individual things as well. He can, for instance, castle and then go for a setup like this, which is, I'm not sure if it has a specific name. I think it's fair to call it the anti-Queen's Indian, where White's trying to play e4, where we have plenty of choices when it's possible to go knight e4, reaching perhaps a slightly more, a slightly passive, yet a very, very solid position. And that's how many grandmasters continue it. I believe, what game did I say? I think either between Igor Lisi and Lugar Gashimov as black, or vice versa. Perhaps Lisi could be black, I'm not sure. But there is definitely a game in this line where Lisi was on either side, and black ended up winning here after 100 moves. See, I remember the game lasted 100 moves, but I'm not sure who played with what pieces. But it's possible to also go for the hedgehog positions, or, of course, it's very thematic for us to go for the structures after d5, which will be very, very consistent with the other Queen's Indian recommendations. Now, White can also, of course, choose to play d3 here, which will be the very distinctive opening in a league of its own, the King's Indian attack. Actually, I have another question by Don Robert. I read somewhere that d5 loses strategically already. Well, I'm unfortunately not sure how that happens. If you told me, I would be very grateful. I guess I would either, beat a few black players as black, because so many Grandmasters 2700 have used this line, or I would probably sell this knowledge to some Grandmaster. So if you do know it, please drop me a line at my email. I would be very thankful. But if we are being serious at this point, well, after d5, I guess that's the position you mean. The thing is, after cd5, we have two choices. We can play ed5 and get the position with the hanging pawns after, let's say, d4, when eventually black plays c5, and either puts the knight on d7, or the classic Karpovian maneuver, knight a6, c7, e6. where the knight's both protecting the pawn on c5 and is putting pressure on d4 and is maybe controlling f4 and g5. So this is one type of positions. And the other type of positions here would arise when black would take back with the knight, allowing, for instance, for e4, knight c3, bc. And these positions are also very, very interesting for black. I think they're definitely not lost strategically or anything. So I guess I mean, white does have the center, of course. That's something we cannot argue, we cannot debate. But white has the center in many openings. If we were to, take it that far, we would say Grunfeld loses, strategically. King's Indian loses strategically. Perk loses strategically. Even so, I would probably agree about the Perk part, but okay, that's my personal taste. Many grandmasters use it as well. But yeah, white does have the center, but black has quite a lot of pressure on it. He can try to utilize after taking his extra pawn on the queen side in the endgame. He can try to put more pressure on the pawn on e4. He can use the open c file for his rook and for his other pieces. And well, this is a very interesting reach type of position. So if someone says, black is lost strategically here, perhaps they just haven't studied these positions deeply and they see just one factor, the white center, while ignoring multiple other factors, which of course should not be done. Now, returning back to the King's Indian attack, the move d3 and move 5. This is definitely an opening in a league of its own. And actually, it's a very interesting setup. But I believe that by simply playing d5 and transposing back to the standard King's Indian attack positions, black is perfectly fine. And later it's likely that white will do all the typical stuff like, knight d2, we would develop, white will push this pawn, white will put it eventually on e5 and so on, white will play rook e1, and then he'll put his knight on f1, this h4, knight h2, knight g4, all this kind of stuff. And black will start advancing his pawns on the queen side. And this is a very interesting rich position where, objectively, of course, things are pretty balanced. I personally don't really think that white can be very principled here in that regard, that I think white is not on time to, just go for checkmate and ignore whatever we've been doing on the queen side. If white tries to play it in such a kamikaze way, he will just lose. He is guaranteed to fail. So the real battle here arises when white makes a certain amount of progress on the king side, black makes a certain amount of progress on the queen side, and then white switches to the defense, white deals with our threats, and then we either try to create more pressure on the queen side or we try to stop his ideas on the king side. So yeah, this is a very interesting battle where we both need to be aware of standard ideas like sacrifices of a piece. White can have like some ideas when the black pawn is on h6, white knight's on g4, this knight actually. When white, let's say, pushes h5, black plays h6, white has this knight on h4, and then either bishop h6 or knight h6 follows, and black's position might either fall apart or the sacrifice might be just a blow in the air. White might just yell in the air with this move and not achieve anything and lose. So it's important to understand, let's say, when the sacrifice works and when it doesn't, and it's important to understand what kind of standard ideas we have ourselves on the queen side. And obviously, it's a very interesting, complicated position, as you might guess. So yeah, that definitely, I appreciate the fact that it's a serious opening. We analyze it seriously, but at the same time, I'm not afraid of it or anything. If I'm afraid of anything, then I would be afraid of the main lines where we need to react precisely and where white is actually trying to pose problems and where we need to sometimes play the only moves. But definitely not with the King's Indian attack, even though it's a good opening, objectively speaking. I mean, it's a decent opening. It's one of the interesting sideline openings which are strategically sounded, which makes sense. Now, I'm curious if we have any more questions. So, to speak a little more about the course, I also covered all the sidelines after d4, namely the Trompovsky, which is of course very important. And actually the good news about the coverage in the course is that it's very suitable for everyone. I mean, after bishop g5, no matter what you play, whether you play, let's say, King's Indian or Grunfeld or Benoni or Queen's Indian or Nibs or whatever it is, it's possible to pick the identical same system against the Trompovsky. And actually, in the course, I'm recommending the move c5, which I think is very combative and interesting. And of course, black has some other choices too, like let's say d5, which is a very solid move. But I think c5 is a very principled choice. And I've discovered some idea which would, after 6 or 7 moves only, most likely leave white on a completely unexplored new ground, which is, of course, fantastic news. And I have covered all the sidelines like Verisov, you know, the so-called Jabava land and all these moves, bishop f4 and stuff, which have become a little bit popular over the last years. But objectively, of course, they are not a legitimate try for the opening advantage. It's always possible to lose in such openings very quickly. Like, let's say you can always play something like c5, e3, knight c6, where after knight b5 you'll be done. But as long as you don't do things like that, you should be fine. And I'm recommending a very solid approach here for black, which of course avoids this trap and which explains how we need to set up our pieces. What else is there? I'm thinking. Of course, I have also analyzed the move c4 as well, and I've also incorporated this accelerated Quinzenian approach in our solution to move 1 c4 too. So that's an absolutely complete full black repertoire against 1 d4, 1 c4, and 1 knight f3. And I would also like to mention that while this is my latest course, I have published several other ones as well on Chessable. For example, I've published a course on e4 e5, a black full repertoire versus e4 e5, which together with this recent fresh course would give you an absolutely full black repertoire. And this repertoire has received such amazing positive feedback from Chessable users that we even decided to convert it in a print book. And very soon it will actually come out in print with one of the most reputable publishing houses out there in the chess world. I'm not sure if I can yet reveal who this will be and what the book would look like, but this is something I'm extremely excited about. Everything is already edited, the artwork has been made, and yeah, the book is about to see the world pretty soon. And of course, e4 e5 is something I've played for not for my entire chess career, but for the last 3 years or so, and I've used it almost exclusively. Sometimes I did play some Caro-Kann or Sicilian out in the round, but I've mostly always gone with e4 e5, both versus the opponents rated 200-300 points lower than me and grandmasters. For instance, I've played Lazaro Bruzon, a former number 25 in the world or so. In October of 2019, I went e4 e5 and held the draw quite comfortably. Or I've played it actually in that tournament in October where I got my second IM norm. I've played it for 5 times, I believe, e4 e5. And I haven't suffered a single loss. And generally speaking, if you look at my record in e4 e5, I have no reasons to complain. So I've tried to pass on all that knowledge in this Chessable course, which will soon also be a physical book. Now, Ekim just wrote in the chat, he just purchased it. Thank you for supporting me as an author and for supporting Chessable. And I hope you will definitely enjoy it. Yeah, there is no possibility, as far as I know, to export from Chessable to PGN. But the whole point of Chessable is that it allows you to drill variations with their unique technology called Move Trainer. So you might want to give this a try if Chessable is something you're new to. A lot of friends of mine, titled players, have been using it. It's really interesting. And of course, there are still some downsides on Chessable, like, you can't use an engine as strong as in Chessbase and so on. But, well, that's not what the site has been designed for. But if you want to, for instance, just, put some position in Chessbase and check it with the engine, you can always either type it in manually or copy this VEN code or something like that. It's not too difficult, or just copy the text with Control-C, Control-V. So yeah, there is no possibility to export, but you can always just get some critical positions in. That's hopefully not too difficult. Now, Deviate says, this dude looks like a character from a Dostoevsky random book. Well, Dostoevsky is definitely one of my favorite authors. So I don't know what to say about that. But, depending on what kind of a character it is, it could be either a compliment or the opposite, quite the opposite. So it depends, I guess. Not sure if you have seen the his characters visualized, but I guess yeah, we do have some pretty. I do have some pretty distinctive Slavic appearance. Maybe one of the Karamazov brothers. That's an interesting Assumption. Um, Best plan against the London system is the question I've just received on a Chess24 broadcast chat. And actually, there's another question again: how to play against the London system, which was asked by Let Me Win. Well, speaking of an easy way, like I said, I'm suggesting a very easy solution, in my opinion, in the course. And the great news is that, like I said 5 minutes ago, even if you don't play the Queen's Indian or Nimza, you can always use the setups knight f6, d5, c5, e6, knight c6. And then after you arrive at a critical position on move 5, like this, or move 6, sorry, not c4, the habit, knight f3, for example, d5, here, here, here. Knight c6, knight d2, e6, c3. Here you've got a plethora of choices, and I'm recommending a very rare line, which I would definitely like you to check out. But there's also main moves like, this bishop d6 and stuff. But I personally think it's better to go for some unexplored sideline as long as you're sure it's safe and sound objectively. That's something I'm suggesting. Well, you're asking what's the best reply to d4 and knight f3. I always, find such questions a little funny and think of them very philosophically. I guess, one answer could be there is no one knows. The other question could be that, yeah, objectively there is, some ultimately best chess opening, like let's say you meet e4 only with e5 or with c5, or you meet d4 with some Grunwald or Nimzo only, and everything else is bad outright. Well, if you check it with some super powerful engine, it would, yeah, indeed say that, one or two openings are better than others from some ultimate chess god standpoint. But do I really care about it? Not really. I think the best opening, I think this is the right answer. I think the best opening is the opening you like, is the opening which fits well with your needs and your level. What I mean by needs is that, let's say, some player rated 2000 might be a talented junior climbing up who will be a grandmaster in a few years, or someone might be a 2000 who, works a full-time job and just plays chess once a year in some tournament or online. They're of the same level, but they clearly have different needs and different possibilities. One player might study chess for several hours a day, the other has no time. Or, they might have a different level. If you're a world-class grandmaster, of course, your demands will be different than the ones of a club player who just plays casually. So I believe that up to a level of, let's say, 25, 2600 video, which is way above than, the level of 99.9% of viewers of the show, any opening is good. Any opening, absolutely any opening that you like, that you understand, where you clearly know what the typical plans and ideas are, where you have some model players or games to follow, where you need to memorize just exactly as much as you're willing to, either not too much or instead quite a lot, will suit you well. It's just that also players have different personalities, and this is why chess is such an amazing game. It allows us to express ourselves. Some of you, like to play it in a very sharp manner. You might want to go for some Benoni. Some of you like to play positionally without risking too much. You might want to go with Queen's Gambit Declined or Slav or Queen's Indian like myself. So there is no obvious, one size fits all solution. I think it's very important to keep in mind that, yeah, chess is a very wide, broad game, and there's plenty of choices available. And you need to pick the choice which fits you personally. That's how you achieve success. Otherwise, no matter how good the opening is, if you don't like it, you wouldn't have any fun and any results with it. If you like positional play and you go for an opening where you need to sacrifice stuff in every line, you'll be very uncomfortable, or vice versa. If you hate positional play and you want to sacrifice, don't get yourself in a position where you need to maneuver calmly. That's not going to end up any good for you. So yeah, speaking of London system, I've given a pretty extensive answer like half an hour ago. So I guess we don't want to repeat that. And hopefully I did give a brief answer now. Go back to the recording, please, when the show is posted. and check out my answer. Now, what else do we have here? Um, do we have any other questions? I'm wondering. Actually, I believe. We've been already live for nearly an hour and a half, which is quite a bit. So I guess I'll answer another question or two, and we'll be slowly finishing. Meanwhile, please check out my repertoire at chessable.com/Yuriy or chessable.com, and then you just open all of their new courses and you'll see mine, the Accelerated Queen's Indian Defense, complete repertoire against 1d4, 1 knight f3, and 1 c4. I don't think we have any questions at the moment. Do we? So guys, if you're willing to ask anything, please take your chance right now, or in a few minutes it might be a little too late. Looks like we've got some silence over here. I see 50 people are watching, and perhaps all the questions have already been answered. All the answers have already been given. What else can I tell you? Well, I really hope to make this a constant, regular show. I think the format will be a little bit different than the one we've had now, because the current show is clearly, a little bit, spontaneous. We did prepare, of course, but you haven't had a chance to prepare questions in advance. I would definitely be very interested in hosting something like an opening clinic in the future where I'll answer very specific opening questions. I would find it very interesting, and considering I would have the time to prepare and you would have the time to prepare and ask some really critical questions, that would be very fun. Now, Piat is asking another question about hippopotamus opening. Well, the thing is, how to play against 1b3 is already discussed. Well, I didn't give a very detailed answer to this, but I tried to give a very practical answer to this, both against 1b3 on move 1 and against 1b3 after knight f3 and then b3 on move 2. Now, speaking of hippopotamus opening, just as any other, crappy opening like 1g4 or 1f4 or 1b4, well, it is possible to make those moves. And like I said, if you're not, a titled player, most likely your performance right now would not even suffer. But I personally recommend to my students that they play some normal sound openings. And I understand some are more sound or less sound than others. Let's say King's Indian Defense is clearly less sound and opening than, let's say, the Queen's Gambit Declined, but it's a very decent choice. And the reason why I suggest that my students play normal main lines or even side lines, but in a decent, respectable, reputable opening, is because while they do need to do some work in order to play these positions well, my ultimate goal is not to have them win this specific game. My ultimate goal is to have them improve in half a year or in a year, is to make them much better players. And I feel that if you just restrain yourself to some very, very, abstract setup, like let's say you always play knight f3, g3, bishop g2, d3, knight f3, g3, bishop g2, d3, knight d2, c3, queen c2, in every single game, well, you won't be exposed to the huge variety of positions, and your development as a player will eventually slow down quite a bit. And while such variations or, some trappy variations in the main lines, which are clearly not good, you might use them for the short-term gains, I think if you're willing to become a better player, ultimately, you should be looking for the more serious options. And it does not have to be a very main opening. It can be some sideline, but you do need to play a line where you get to experience several interesting pawn structures, where you get to experience various types of positions, where you get to be quite ambitious and be quite principled. I think that's rather important. And when you do that for years, you get to appreciate the importance, of, let's say, the ability to fight for initiative, the importance of attacks, the importance of the latent development, and so on and so forth. That's why I always suggest that my beginner students start with the move e4 and play some gambit lines, some sharp lines, because this way they will get to understand the importance of some core chess values, such as rapid development and stuff like this. But instead, if you start with some very, very distinctive minor scheme and just limit your chess, the huge world of chess, to the small town or to the small, I don't know, apartment, so to speak, or to some very, very distinctive minor variation, like I said, King's Indian Attack or Hippopotamus or whatever it is, you might not be able to reach your full potential in chess, which of course is a little bit of a disappointment. And I know not all the players are as ambitious. Some players just play casually. In that case, it is, an adequate decision to restrain the amount of time they put in their opening study. But I typically suggest that people play something more principled and more critical, where they get to appreciate and learn the key important chess values. Now, what else do we have here in the chat? In Sicilian, you always play a Lapin variation. Okay, a few more questions. So yeah, there is no option to download from Chessable. Yeah, there is no option to download from Chessable. But I think Chessable is actually working on a mobile app, and I think they're working on their offline version. I'm not a developer, so I have no clue when this will be ready, but I believe they're definitely taking steps in order to take some measures. And they have a very motivated and qualified team of developers, so I definitely think they will be able to reach a lot of progress in this regard. Speaking of the Sicilian and you playing Galapin, that's exactly what I meant. It's a very good, interesting choice. It's not necessarily the best, variation objectively, but it's a type of position. It's a decent opening. You get isolated pawns quite often, for instance, if you like them. And it's a type of an opening which you can definitely enjoy for a long time. It's principled. It's quite critical. If black doesn't know what he is doing, he will easily end up in trouble. And at the same time, you might not need to spend as much time learning the main lines. Speaking of Hippopotamus for black, I mean, well, as black, you definitely don't want to be playing this way, objectively speaking. But some players might feel more inclined to experiment a little more. So yeah, I think we've answered quite a lot of questions here about Chessable, about openings. We've looked at a model game. We've talked about my course. We've answered several questions of yours, and I think we might be already want to be finishing quickly. I do hope to go live soon again and to be doing this regularly. Thank all of you so much for watching. It has been a huge pleasure to be hosting the show, and this has been a huge pleasure to be able to answer your questions in the live show. Sorry for the slight technical problems we've experienced in the beginning. It was my fault, but everything seems to be fixed at the moment, and I really, really look forward to speaking to you soon. Do make sure to check out my course at chessable.com/Yuriy. Thank all of you for watching.